Episode 44 of All the Horrible Things. Brought to you by, if we could pick any sponsor, what sponsor would you love to have on board?
Specifically for this episode?
Oh, I think just in general, All the Horrible Things, sponsored in part by, for me, it's Ovaltine. Clearly, I'm an Ovaltine man. Most of the time we're doing this, I'm drinking Ovaltine.
Is that
so,
real?
I'm dead serious.
I had no idea this detail about you.
If I was a horror figure, I would be the milkman because I drink so much milk. It's absolutely disgusting. You know how all these shows lately, the bad guys, like in The Boys or in that Quentin Tarantino movies, what is it, Inglourious Bastards, the bad guys drink milk.
Because
maybe I'm inherently evil.
Adults don't normally drink milk. We are the only, I'm going to say we're the only mammal that, or maybe just even animal that continues to drink milk after, a certain age.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm just man-child forever, but that's where I get my water. I get a lot of guff for not drinking enough water, but I'm like, but there's water in milk, and it tastes so much more delicious with all that lactose involved.
I really thought you were saying that the Ovaltine because of like a Christmas story, like be sure to drink your Ovaltine. Like what the?
No. Ovaltine's always been a staple of my diet. It gives me lots of sugar. Love that sugar and all sorts of vitamins as well. But yeah, I always associate it with, of course, Seinfeld. The Ovaltine.
Oh yeah.
Jokes.
Why is it round? We should call it round.
That's true. It is an accurate assessment. He's
I don't
really
have
good
a
at
sponsor though.
observations.
I don't have something
you don't
in mind.
Nothing?
Like a dream sponsor. I think it would be like.
Well, you're a Subaru guy. I think we should get Subaru on board here, right?
I do like Subaru. I think it's a well-made vehicle that lasts a very long time. Brought to you by Subaru.
There you go. I mean, does Subaru have any electric vehicles yet? Because we don't want to be ruining the planet here with all the horrible things.
I think they have a hybrid, and I think it's just really hard to come by. I think that they're working towards it. They're really
Excellent.
known for not having your family killed in an accident, though.
Well, this is good. So if there's any listeners out there who can grease the wheels with either Subaru or Ovaltine, we'd appreciate it.
It should be Subaru, stay alive.
Yes, very nice. Good tie in there.
Thank you.
Well, you're right. We're on episode 44, and today is the 3rd. We've somehow made it to February 3rd. It's a hard thing to do. Just ask Bill Murray. And we, of course, are going to talk about Groundhog Day, but in a unique fashion. We're going to talk about how Groundhog Day itself is really a horror film at its heart.
Absolutely. Yes, it's a living nightmare. It's a living nightmare.
It really is. It absolutely is. I mean, it comes off like this sweet little rom-com, but Harold Ramis, who directed it, is a very dark man. He's very dark. I'm kidding, of course. He's a very, very lovable dude. But I think he does have the sense to see the darkness in something like this. A lot of people have acknowledged that it's existential in its nature, but I think we as horror aficionados can go that further step to kind of see the tropes within it that make it horror.
Absolutely.
That's the first part of this cast.
Yes.
What else are we going to do?
Well, we're going to talk about its influence on, specifically other horror movies. It's a very influential film. I mean, it's not just used within the horror genre. I've seen that Andy Samberg movie. I think it's called Palm Springs. Basically, did an updated version of it. There's the really fun Tom Cruise movie, which I think is called it's called
Edge of Tomorrow, which actually I wish we had watched that for this as well, because there are horror elements to that.
There really are. There are. It was called originally, I think it was called Live, Die, Repeat, which is a fucking awesome name. Apparently they didn't want to go with it.
It was based on a comic book. Yeah. So that's what the comic was initially called.
Yeah.
But
as far as I know, Harold Ramis did it first with Groundhog Day. And there are parts in this movie where we can see Bill Murray almost at a breaking point. He does, before he gets to his redemption and redeeming qualities and doing good deeds, he really lives it up. And when he drives those other guys over the cliff, he takes advantage of certain individuals. There are breaking points for this character, which is why it's so ripe for horror.
I completely agree.
It's
It,
who is the and I believe it's talked about in one of our other movies, the or maybe actually brought up in two of the different movies, and we'll get into that. The Greek character who has to push a rock up a hill until
Sisyphus.
Sisyphus.
Oh my goodness. It's interesting you're bringing up Sisyphus because one of the movies we're going to talk about after Groundhog Day is Triangle, and
That's
the
what I'm
name
talking
of the
about.
big barge in that is Aeolus, who is the god of wind, whose son was Sisyphus.
Right, the father, and that's what I was getting at. Is like that essentially is Groundhog Day. The idea of you doing this task, you get to the top, and then you have to start all over again, and it's it's live, die, repeat.
Yeah. No, that's very accurate, and I actually didn't put that two and two together till you just hit me with that. All these movies do have that Sisyphusian thread to them. I did want to mention one other movie that does this same sort of thing, and that has our boy Ronnie Chang, who we talked about last week in Megan. And this was the one I mentioned before. I didn't know the name of it. It's called Long Story Short, and it's an Australian romantic comedy. It's actually, I'm not a huge romantic comedy guy, but I would vouch for this one because this trope does work well based on the cast. And Ronnie Chang actually is really is a dramatic part. The poor boy. Yeah, he's suffering from some terrible maladies in it. So it does work. But of course, the main character's trying to figure out a way to make him not end up with this issue.
Sure.
But let's talk Groundhog Day. I want to start it with this existential question, right? What would you design heaven as? Let's say there is heaven.
Yeah.
What would you say would be your dream heaven? What would it look like? What would the day-to-day be or the forever be?
I honestly believe the idea of heaven was created for everyone in the same dream where you are just reunited with the people that you've loved and lost. And that, I think, is why it was, dreamt up that way. It gives you something to live for when you decide to move on, or not. Maybe it's not your decision, but when you do move on, it's supposed to be you reuniting with your friends and family, and maybe even pets, because all dogs go to heaven. So
Cujo? I'm not sure about Cujo.
Cujo, yeah, he just had to say a couple Hail Marys and he was forgiven.
So, okay, so are you saying then you would ascribe to this sort of mass concept of heaven, and that you want to go up there, you want to chill with your friends and family for all of eternity?
So that's what I'm getting at, because I there's no question I'm a selfish individual. So I think you would pick and choose. So in this dream scenario that heaven was dreamt up as, that you get to meet everyone, don't you have selfish reasons, like the things, the greed still, even though you're supposed to leave that behind, you still have the greediness. And I will connect it to Groundhog's Day, because Bill Murray is Phil Connors. When he's sitting in the bowling alley with those two guys before they drive home drunk, that he says, he talks about being on an island with a beautiful woman, and they drank, and then they made love, and those guys are like, ooh, even as grown men, they're like, ooh, like a couple of schoolboys or schoolgirls. So Phil Connors is describing probably what a lot of people would want in their heaven. They want paradise, and also heaven has been described as paradise, but it's that selfish, like, I want to be on a beach with drinks, and so is that so wrong?
I get that. Yes, it is wrong, because it's going to get boring no matter what. This is the big conundrum for me, because when I'm trying to think about the best day that I've ever had or could dream of having, I'm still going to get sick of it if I'm looped in this same pleasure pool forever. To me, I don't necessarily want to be me in the next realm. You know what I'm saying? I would like either just something completely fresh or just the blackness, versus some sort of chilling with friends and family forever is going to get boring. I've barely got enough to talk about now with them.
It's the same
let alone
idea
for eternity.
of living forever, right? Like Highlander or a vampire. You're going to get lonely, because at least in those situations, you're not with the people you love because you have outlived them. But I completely agree and understand with what you're saying. It's like, that sounds more like a hell to me. Repeating the same thing over and over again is a living, or for Phil Connors, it was a living hell. That is the root
of why we call this Groundhog Day horror, because it to me is a hell dimension. I've seen it in shows like Angel, where somebody's in hell and they're doing the same horrible thing, and it always ends with them like, getting killed by a loved one or something.
Sisyphus.
So the loop is the horror. Yes. Yeah. Sisyphusian and horror escape.
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at Groundhog Day, he is in a very bleak small town, so there's a message there too about the idea of someone from the big city, how they can never really agree with someone else's way of life, of like, why do people live like this, like the Norman Rockwell scenario where you're just in this, you know, picture perfect small town, everyone knows your name, but they show in this movie everybody knows your name can be a terrible thing, and people, because he's so selfish, Phil Connors.
There is that burden that he comes in with of he's in the car with Andy, or in the van rather, with Andy and Chris Elliott's character, and he says, I'm probably going to be quitting this anyway, I got bigger fish to fry. And it brings me to like what I see as this like Nietzschean, the quote from Nietzsche that really encompasses this whole movie and why it is scary is hope in reality is the worst of all evil because it prolongs the torments of man. So throughout this whole thing, there is these hopes that he has that will never be fulfilled. Right. He wants to become a bigger shot weatherman, even though he's in Pittsburgh and he's doing really well for himself. And he seems to be loved despite the archetype of the weatherman being someone that people kind of like hate because they bring bad news about a rainy wedding, or cold weather to come. They're the guy that often gets, or woman that often gets vilified when it comes to the local news. So he's accountable for the bad weather, even though he actually isn't in a way. So that innately is problematic. Not to mention the horrible, terrible song in the intro when they're driving in, I'm Your Weatherman. Yeah. I understand the context is appropriate, but I hate that song. And that's the only thing that really dates this movie and kind of takes me out of how amazing it is. It's just that one song. I don't know. That's my only like real big beef with it.
Couldn't you argue that the Sonny and Cher, put your little hand in mine?
I love that song. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No.
Over and over, no.
Right.
But
that's my point.
You're right. And I think you are probably right, and most people do see that kind of cheesy, lovey-dovey song as being torturous, right? Yeah. And to wake up to that every morning. And really, when the root of this is him being so greedy and selfish and alone and not really having any connection with people, and he's never really going to get it, you know? It's and it's unattainable. And even at the end, I'd like to talk about that a little later, but I do wonder. Yeah. I do wonder if song, it's so good that he got to get out of that day.
Yeah. And the song in itself is ironic. Babe, I got you, babe. And when he's searching for this, well, he wants Andie MacDowell's character after a while, you know, when he really comes to love her, and he can't have her because the day resets, or she doesn't like who he really is, and he needs to change. But
yeah. There's something a little problematic about the relationship. I can't deny that too, because you do have weird inter-office like strangeness going on. Sure, there is a certain of misogyny in Bill Murray's character that we can't deny, right?
I will argue.
You got to put that up front.
Yes, I will argue that in the news world, it's a little bit differently, or in the production world, that she's probably more of a freelance producer, or in that situation where if they were to live a normal life, she probably wouldn't be working with him day in and day out. So I see what you're saying, but it is, it's still inner office mingling, you know, like where, well, it was in a different time though. It's frowned on now. For sure.
I know. Yeah. What is it? 93. So yeah, I mean, you got to cut it a little bit of slack, but that is one of the other areas that now, were it to ever be remade, which it shouldn't, because it is a masterpiece of sorts. I don't know what you do. I don't know what you do in that scenario. I guess it's better that she's the one that has the power over him. It would probably be really horrible if she was like the assistant that came in that he's trying to win over. But I still got a little issues with it.
Sure.
But let's go back to how this day is a hellscape. So you got annoying radio jockeys in the morning. Everybody hates freaking radio jockeys that think they're hilarious, and when they're not, they hear they hear that every morning to wake up to that nonsense. And then of course when he leaves, he deals with this overly optimistic guy, and I don't know about you, but waking up for me is hard no matter what. Even when I have the most amazing day ahead of me, it can be a struggle, you know? So then to step out the door to, you know, this jolly fellow
morning person
you don't really want to deal with, you know? So essentially when somebody makes you feel crappier than you already did, we start off with that.
That guy's
then great. I want to jump. He is fun. He's a lot of fun. And his reaction when Murray nails it at the end, when he like gives him this beautiful quote about what winter is and such, he just looks so moved and so touched by it.
Yeah. He's a Second City guy.
I loved it. Yeah, he for such a small little part, he really makes an impression.
Nailed it.
And then of course, I don't like eating buffets. I don't like eating with other people and picking up. I feel like a Larry David here, but like then he has to go down and have the bed and breakfast where there's everybody pulling from the same pile. I mean that
don't forget
minuscule hellscape, but
don't forget one of the worst things ever is that he has no hot water in that shower.
No hot water.
That itself is torture.
Absolutely. I love her reaction too. Is like, no hot water. Well, there wouldn't be today, would there? Yeah, you're absolutely right. The cold water in the morning, and then followed up by him stepping in the puddle, the ice puddle. Cold, wet feet is something that I would be stuck with in hell for sure, because I hate that feeling more than most things.
Torture.
And that actually proceeds the interaction with Needle Nose Ned.
Yeah,
and I do find Needle Nose Ned as a horror trope really fascinating in that there's very few things that I fear more than running into people that I don't want to run into, let alone people that have dated my sister in the past. You know?
And not just that, he's an insurance salesman, which is one of the biggest tropes for like people don't want to talk about life insurance, which is even more ironic because he can't die right now.
That's very true. That's very true. Yeah. So he doesn't want to talk to him, and then just having to deal with him constantly.
Yes.
I mean, eventually he does buy all the plans, which is one area I was like, I don't know if that's the best way to approach making that relationship between you and Needle Nose Ned better by just buying it all.
Like, here you go. Here's my money.
Exactly. I like the other things that he does, very altruistic, but just to buy a bunch of insurance plans. I'm not really big on that one.
No.
And of course, even as the weatherman, he's stuck, even outside of this day, stuck in a job where he does the same thing, predictable thing over and over again. Yeah. And I could see how it just wouldn't be fulfilling for his character in and outside of that day. Here's a question for you. If you were in hell, would you rather have a cold hell or a hot hell?
Well, there's so many questions here, like, because I hate sweating. I fucking hate sweating. So I think I'd rather go to the
You're
cold.
naked in both.
I'd rather be cold.
I would take a hot hell any day than to be froze. I do not like being cold much more than I don't like being hot. And I understand the logic of, okay, you can put on more layers if you're cold. Yeah. But we're talking about the hellscape here of cold versus hot.
They probably wouldn't give you the layers. So maybe you're right. Maybe sweating is the way
and
to go.
You're going to burn off my like sensors too. I don't know. I hate being cold. So for me, February in Pennsylvania can be considered a hellscape. This is why people have the seasonal affective disorder. It's because of the way that atmosphere makes you feel.
Yeah. And let's point out a truth right now is that they really filmed this movie in Woodstock, Illinois. So that hell is the hell that we currently live in. It is February outside of our window.
Well, all right. Woodstock, I haven't been there. I actually do want to visit it because they have their own Groundhog now. Did you hear about this?
No, I did not.
They have so much notoriety because a lot of people do know that it was filmed there, despite being claimed to be in Punxsutawney, and they have Woodstock Willie as their owned Groundhog
instead of Punxsutawney,
which I found fascinating.
Is that his name? Punxsutawney?
Yeah, Punxsutawney Phil. They're both Phils.
I was going to say they're both Phils.
Remember that really fun character actor who's also in The Burbs. He's Gus in The Burbs. And it was the same one of the guys that he got drunk with at the bowling alley.
Yes.
And he says, "Your name is Phil too, like the Groundhog?" And it's like the funniest thing in the world to him when it's, not all that funny
at all.
But yeah, I did want to mention more about Woodstock because it's an interesting place for them to have filmed it. Harold was suggested that location because the director of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles used that for a lot of the scenes too. So Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is what kind of inspired it being filmed there. And Orson Welles considers Woodstock his home when he was asked what would you consider like your hometown, and he spent 4 or 5 years there going to school in his youth, and he says, this is the only town that I could ever really say I consider my hometown. So, as horror people that we are, Orson Welles definitely dabbles in the dark and macabre. So I thought that was fascinating.
That's crazy. I did not know
It has actually a pretty rich history for such a small little town. I got to give it credit for that. It was the big typewriter city. So given all of these, words and films that are coming out of it, it makes sense that back in the day, there was multiple typewriter companies set up in Woodstock. So I found that also kind of interesting. Do you know much about the history of Groundhog Day?
I do not. I hope that you do.
So not too much. I did a little dabbling here, but of course it did start in Germany, and it was called like a Candlemas to see if there was going to be more winter. But interestingly, it was either there's going to be 4 weeks if it sees its shadow, or a shorter winter. But 4 weeks is pretty short as it is.
Yeah, 6.
And we got it. We have it 6 here, 6 more weeks, or in early spring, which to me is really vague here in the States. But initially, it was not even a groundhog; it was a badger, which I found kind of interesting in itself. Because at one point did it make that switch?
Badger Day.
And actually, a lot of in Latin, I guess it's called like the bear rat. I mean, badgers and groundhogs have some similarities, but you got that bear rat business in there, which I also found pretty cool. But isn't it a little counterintuitive, right? It's going to be 6 more weeks of winter if he sees his shadow when it's a sunny day. Wouldn't you think if it's sunny, you're more likely to get warmth sooner? It always like blew my mind as a kid. It's like, why wouldn't he want to see his shadow? That means the sun's out and it's warmer.
No, it's a scam. They always know he's going to see his shadow, and they always can't predict the weather.
I know. That's jerks. Are you telling me this is a gimmick holiday just to get people ultimately to give weatherman something to talk about other than
exactly? I'm just glad
what's on the green screen or the blue screen.
Gifts or cards on that day. Good grief.
There should be, right? I think I could use what do groundhogs eat? A little groundhog basket of like nuts and berries or something.
Probably apples.
On that day would be nice. Yeah, they probably do eat apples. Were there any other horror aspects of this that you wanted to notice? I mean, there's certainly the existential despair of nothing changing. Just the name of the area in which they do the ceremony and pull out the hog is called Gobbler's Knob.
Gobbler's Knob. Which is really gross.
Which is a pretty horrific name if you think about it.
Oh, yeah.
Both sound sinister and dirty at the same time. Yeah. But I honestly think not being able to die is worse than any hell.
Yeah. I think for me, this is, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but small town America. I mean, I'm a city guy, so for me that's kind of like my hell. Like I like variety in life. I don't want to go to the same corner store. And I think that's another thing is like, you couldn't do this movie in the city. I mean, there's too many options.
No, that's very true, because ultimately the payoff is him being able to connect with so many people in that small town that would have been impossible in the city. That being said, even though I would definitely say I need the culture of living in a city and being connected to the pulse, it's also not great. A couple of weeks ago, waking up at 4 a.m. to the sound of catalytic converters being ground out from underneath a car right outside the apartment. Yeah. So there's the upsides and the downsides to both, of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm a city boy through and through. Same. But here's my final question for you about this is about the ending, right? Because he ultimately does break free after he saves the kid from falling. He replaces the
tire.
Pop tire, right? And he makes sure that young couple gets married. Speaking of which, am I crazy? I should be looking this up right now.
Shannon. That is Michael Shannon.
It is Michael Shannon. Oh my goodness. Yeah. He was a handsome young devil.
Yeah,
another Chicago actor.
Yeah, got to start here. I mean, that's why the therapist is played by Dave Pasquesi, another Chicago Second City alum. Harold Ramis. Right. This is like his. I mean, it's his home. So he wanted to, have, supporting people that like he knew. And Michael Shannon, the WrestleMania tickets cracks me up every time. Oh
my gosh, it's so good. Yeah. Actually, the piano teacher, I wanted to mention this, the piano teacher, went to high school with my dad.
Is that right?
So he like knows her. Yeah. I don't know. I hope she's still around.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I remember. He always saying, yeah, that's the celebrity I know is the piano teacher from Groundhog Day, who was great too. I love it on that last day. And he's just like a savant. He knows it so well. He's like, this is my best student. He's my student.
Yes.
She's great. She was great in it. But yeah, okay, here it is. So isn't it scarier after being this like god of sorts, because there's that one day where he tells her, I'm a god, I know everything, but to then not tell her that and to be seen as this like amazing guy, what happens that next day when he doesn't know what's coming? So essentially the existential horror of trying to live up to that day for Andie MacDowell moving forward.
That's a good point.
That to me is almost as scary as the repeat.
No, that's a great point. And like he has all these weird talents now. It's like, what do you do with your life now? It's like, are you going to continue to be a weatherman? Are you going to be a jazz pianist?
Exactly. I'm just worried that it's not going to go good for him after this, because given the ratio of screw ups to success, it's inevitable that he's going to say or do something as piggish as he did on most occasions with
Did he really change? That's the question.
Rita. Right. That's what I wonder. Or was it all just, again, selfishness
just to get the girl
past that day?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a tricky one. It really is. It leaves you with a lot of questions, that movie. And that's why I think it's so timeless.
Yeah.
And why it does then work in other movies, this trope, because there's so much there to play with. Which, I mean, unless you want to speak more to Groundhog, I was hoping maybe we move on to Happy Death Day to You.
I think that's a great transition. This is a very fun sequel. We have talked about the first one.
We have.
Which is why this is brilliant. And you suggested it's even better to talk about the sequel.
Exactly, right? It does make sense, because now we're doing the doubling, which is so appropriate, the doubling of the, quadrupling of the infinitying, which I liked this movie, Happy Death Day to You. I liked it about as much as I liked the first one, but maybe less because I wondered how necessary it was.
Sure.
And I was a little bummed because it sets off with this character Ryan Phan, who is one of the smaller characters in the first movie, the buddy of the romantic lead.
Yeah.
And we get to follow him, and he's the one that's waking up in this loop. And I was really excited to see his story.
I know.
Rather than then reverting back to Tree's story, the female final girl, I guess. That's something I want to ask you right off the bat. Can we consider this like horror? It verges on just sci-fi thriller comedy almost, because if there's no stakes, there's no actual death, then it's certainly comedy horror. I guess we can call it that.
Yes,
but
I understand completely what you're suggesting and questioning, and I think the only thing that can really narrow it down to is they do have a slasher character with a mask and a knife, so that's where they connected into horror.
Yeah. And there's some fun, gory stuff in it, but I guess we mentioned Edge of Tomorrow, and to me that was a lot scarier, and that is not, I think, in people's head a horror in the same way this way. And you're absolutely right. It's because of the slasher subgenre that I think this is categorized more as a horror. And of course, Blumhouse being producer.
Yes, exactly. And I will say this, in a subgenre like the slasher, I was happy to see how it was done in this way. It was almost like, how do we keep the slasher genre alive? And it's got to be with creative, interesting ways like this. It's almost just disguised as Groundhog's Day.
Yeah, in the age of the multiverse, you're essentially doing a Groundhog Day plus quantum entanglement. Certainly in Groundhog Day, they don't talk any science. Right? There's nothing along those lines. It is just the, mechanism in which they move the story forward. But in this one, it's happening because of the scientists ultimately that are at the college. Putting together this essentially device that has the capacity to how would you even say it? Like reboot dimensions and splice dimensions.
Yeah,
I'm a little confused about like what happens to the her
yeah,
when she moves into this side dimension sort of thing.
right.
You know, where does she go? Does she just overtake that body?
It's like quantum
and does that other her then go back to her other dimension for a while, and is she going to then go back with that same knowledge? That's what kind of confuses me.
Honestly, I think what you just described is the third movie that they could potentially make, because what you're getting out of this sequel is the justification. If anybody really needed to know what was really happening in the first one and the why, that's why they could justify the sequel. They explained it, even though I didn't really feel as an audience member like I needed to know the science or understand it. It is fun, right? It's fun. It's like the whole Back to the Future thing, like the flux capacitor.
Yes.
I don't really understand what's going on.
Do you remember in the first one? Because there's very subtle moments where you hear the Back to the Future sound effect that's just like everyone knows the doo-doo-doo. I can't do it obviously with me, but it's definitely paying homage to Back to the Future.
Yeah.
That's one of the other things was like before they just played with this one time loop, but in this one time has moved forward. She's now boyfriend, girlfriend with the dude, and she knows everybody. In a way she didn't in the first movie, but then she goes back in time.
Right.
Which was another like, why is she then going back in time? Why isn't she then herself? I was struggling. My biggest problem, I think, with this movie, because it's really fun, I love the cast, it moves really quickly, is the murder motives and the murderers are always let me down. In both of these, I've been let down by why this babyface killer's doing what he's doing or she's doing. Then to go back and use that same murderer. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I see what you're saying, and I understand. It almost seems like because the plot is now so plot heavy on at least in the sequel, unless you're questioning the first movie as well, of like the motives of the killer, it's it almost feels like the motives from the movie Scream. You know, it's like jealousy and betrayal.
But I was more invested in the killers in Scream because you got more of a backstory of them. Granted, I guess we got a little more of the nurse in this one, but she was no longer the killer like she was in the first one. And then you barely see any of the doctor in this one. You just got to kind of remember back to who he was in the first one. And then when he turns out to be the killer, I didn't care. That was my trouble, is I cared so much about Billy and Stu, or even like much more about Laurie Metcalf being the killer in 2. Or, you know, I feel like Scream justifies its killers in a way that this didn't, and maybe that's just because Scream takes itself more seriously, and this does have a little tongue-in-cheekness to it. And I just gotta kind of like get over that, and I do have to end it at some point with some sort of resolution. So
and I guess because the sequel, they're also in this other dimension, things are slightly changed. Just even as obvious as like, well, now that her boyfriend is dating her best friend. So now the killer has also kind of like stepped sideways, and like it is interesting, and you know what's crazy it's all thought out. I mean, the writer, I think it's Christopher Landon, I think his name is. He a very creative writer, and you know, again, it's just like breathing new life into the subgenre that I love, at least.
No, and I definitely appreciated that. And honestly, that the mask is iconic. It's a mask that I think is going to last.
Which is so hard to do.
You hadn't seen anything like it.
Which is so hard to do. When you try to think of a new slasher, you always go back to like, we put a sack on their head. And we're like, well, no, that was the Jason Voorhees in 2 before he became...
Or in Time Crimes, and even we're talking Triangle later. They just put a burlap sack with 2 little holes. And
the baby face.
Call it a day.
It's absurd.
That's great.
And also
it's
hilarious.
Super scary in the dark too. It does have the comedic value, but at the same time, there's a lot of like
the
layers
mascot?
there.
Like what?
It is the mascot to the college. I think they're like the Bethemia babies or something. I can't remember the name of the city or college.
Also just hilarious.
It is. It's very enjoyable. It's something like what had never at one time during watching it thought about turning it off. Like maybe something else we watched later we're going to talk about, but
yes. And here's the last thing
I'm curious
say about
what they would do in the third.
if and I don't know, I mean, I may have put that out there into the universe. I don't know if they're doing a third. I would bet money that they will. I really enjoy the lead actor. I think she's fantastic.
She is great.
Very likable. I will say this though. This was still a really good sequel, which is very hard to do in the horror genre as well.
I agree.
So
I totally agree.
Yeah.
It had a great hook. Like I said, I was really excited to follow
I know.
This Ryan Fan character. So I was immediately sucked in. A little disappointed when we switched back to her, even though she is a great actress, really fun character too. And then it really kind of became about whether or not having your mom in your life or following your heart, your romantic heart, is kind of like, which one do you pick?
Right.
It was interesting. I did like that. I don't feel like that's something that's been overtly done, maybe as plainly as it is in this one.
But that's what anchors it to Groundhog Day. It's like you need to like have your main character go through some change, emotional change, or they just change their outlook on life. So I think that's kind of where I would say it's the most like Groundhog Day, aside from just repeating the same day or death scenario. Is that
it does have a heart?
Yes,
compared to some of these other ones, it does have a heart.
Exactly,
I will give it that for sure. Let's move on.
Yes.
Let's talk about Coherence, which is free on Prime right now for those who have Prime. And this is one that I'd seen a while ago. Is this your first viewing?
This was my first viewing, but this is something I've had on my watch list in my head, and specifically on my letterbox. I've had it as my watch list for such a long time that I think I needed something like this, like an assignment to actually watch it. I loved it.
What kept you from watching it for so long? What was...
just the fact that it kind of got pushed down into my watch list. I had it in my, I literally had it in my Amazon Prime's watch list too, and it just kept getting pushed. I add things to it, and you read the description, you kind of have like no idea what's going on. The poster isn't very great as far as like a movie poster goes. It doesn't really say "watch me." It's just
right. I agree.
But I will say I really enjoyed this movie. It felt like
I remember having liked it a lot, but I actually appreciated it so much more on a second viewing, especially knowing that there was no real script. It was like a Curb Your Enthusiasm for sci-fi thriller horror sort of thing. They were just given their motivations, a paragraph about what needed to be executed. And at times it was a little hard to know what was going on because people were talking over each other a lot.
Right.
But at the same time, I think that almost added to the kind of frenetic confusion that was going on even in their heads, the characters' heads. And it, it actually came out to us as the audience as well.
Yes. And I mean, from the get-go, I really felt like these characters knew each other. I'd say this is a fantastic ensemble. The camera work was really great because it's really hard to shoot improv because you don't necessarily know the exact movements, and they did a really great job there. And what I really loved were those dip to blacks, which you felt like it almost like ended a scene and then it kind of comes back. It's like you don't see that in film a lot. You don't see just like cut to blacks and then like it comes back up. You see hard cuts or
that's a good, I hadn't considered that because one of the big aspects of the mystery that's going on here is when these characters walk through this dipped in black space is when the the splitting occurs between dimensions, I'm assuming. And it's all, for those of you who haven't seen it, it all revolves around this Miller's comet that's passing at this moment, and there's just really kind of easy but effective methods that they use, like phones just cracking. There's not a lot of special effects in this at all, of course. But it does these really subtle things that are still, they still work,
Agreed. And oh man, I really liked, and yes, I'm gonna be giving a spoiler away here, but that's kind of what we do. I really liked the actors retelling of the comment, like some of the stories that had happened before, where she describes the woman who killed her husband and she didn't get tried for anything because the husband was still there. It's really setting up, and when you're watching it for the first time, you kind of don't know what's going on. You're like, there's something there. I know that's something. You're planting a seed, but it really kind of explains exactly what's going to happen in I mean, not
for those who have seen the newest Spider-Man, Far From Home, right? You're dealing with the multiverse, and that's pretty much what this is dealing with.
Yeah.
Granted, there isn't different versions of the person as there is in Far From Home. You know, there's not the Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield. They're all the same, but they're different looking. These people all look the same, but they're differentiated. I thought it was effective enough by the glow sticks that they open at the party when the lights go out. And you really do get a sense of, oh, okay, so that's the blue dimension, that's the green one, that's the red one. So easy, but still worked, and I wasn't annoyed by it, you know, in a way. If they'd done something else to delineate that, I would have been a little frustrated, but I wasn't with that, because it's a low budget movie, but that still has a lot going for it.
Yeah. And there's I'm gonna pluck something else like that's philosophy from this movie that is something else we might talk about from another show that we had both currently watched in From, where they bring up the Schrodinger's cat theory about the cat being in a box, and you know, if the box is closed, there's a 50-50 chance whether it's alive or dead. And I really like that also played such an important part in kind of their, like, how they were going to treat what they were going to do. Like, okay, so we either need to kill them, which is them, another version of themselves, or just
or prevent them from knowing what's going on, like we do.
I thought it was really effective storytelling.
I completely agree. It hit all the right notes for me, honestly. And of course, I got to mention that it's one of the rare times I ever see Nicholas Brendan outside of Buffy. And he's such a perfect person to cast in this, because he's actually a twin. So when his other him comes in and starts strangling him, that's his twin brother doing it, which is so fun.
And his character really plays an actor who has been on a show.
On the WB nonetheless too. Roswell. There's a lot of weird meta stuff going in this movie, and that's another one I wanted to mention, is that the actors' names, a lot of them, not all of them, but the actors' names are kind of mirrored in the characters' names. Our lead is Emily, and her character's name is M.
Yep, I saw
you
that.
have Laureen, and her character is Lee. What else do we have here? We have Elizabeth. The character goes by Beth. Hugo goes by Hugh. Lauren goes by Lori. So it's really interesting how the actors themselves then have kind of created these doppelgangers of themselves with the name, and potentially with how they were playing. I don't know them well enough to know, but because it was improv, safe to say that there is going to be more of them in the character than would normally be in a script, because it's on them to create the character. So I think they're going to borrow from themselves more than they would if they were kind of given a character description, you know?
Yeah. And I think sometimes, you know, and it's got to be really in the right situation, and maybe it's the director, but I think you get sometimes a more real performance out of an actor when they're improvising, because there's a good chance they're just really plucking from like a personal memory, instead of like when you're playing an actor, you have to do research on this character and then interpret how you're going to play this part or how that affected you. But when you're improvising, you're really kind of pulling from, and you could feel this. You could feel it because it really felt more theatrical, not in like an over the top, sometimes over the top stage performance, but in more of like a grounded, emotional performance, which I was just really impressed.
The movement of it too felt theatrical. The way people would come and go,
entrances and
actual
exits.
Blocking meant so much.
Blocking was huge.
It's funny that you mentioned that they did pull from their own selves, because Nicholas Brendan is like known for having substance abuse problems, and of course his character in this does, and that's why I think it was so nice to see him in something else, and I thought he was really not fun, but like good in it. Given that his character was kind of one of the more intense ones.
Yeah, see, I didn't know that. And that is maybe something that the actor suggested. Like, he's like, you know, this is something that I deal with, and it might be something that the character's dealing with. And then it played, again, like improv, it played such an important part in how everything else was going to happen and how people were going to react. The wife, when she sits down next to him and she's like, what are we doing? You know, and he's like, and you could see his moment right there. She seemed a little bit more like curious, like why, but he felt really like I messed up, like in like a lapse, like it was just really, really good.
Just him envisioning what he would be in another dimension, being a drinking version of him.
Yes.
And how scared he was of his potential self.
Yes.
Really interesting. You know, it was dynamic in that. And to kind of wrap it up, I was going to ask you if you, a doppelganger of yourself came in, let's say you barged in on your studio right now. What do you know about your own weaknesses that you'd be able to take out yourself?
Oh, I know I hate getting kicked in the balls. I hate that. Yes. So I would kick myself in the balls knowing very well that we don't like that. What about
All right,
you?
So you got yourself. You know, I would probably just mention the baldness, and then he'd kind of like get morose, and I'd take advantage of him.
And then you'd throw milk in his eyes.
Yes. Or I'd threaten to drain the milk down the sink.
Step one more foot closer, and there's milk gets spilt.
Heck yeah. But I loved it. I definitely think people should see Coherence. It's rare that you get a comet as your kind of like the business that starts it all. And I thought it was effective.
I loved it. And I will say, when I was watching Triangle last night, there were so many moments where I'm like, oh my God, this pairs so well with Coherence. And there are moments that I was thinking like, not getting them confused, but feeling like how there were some similar things that were happening. That's like, it just, what a great transition to start talking about Triangle as well.
Yeah, I agree. Triangle does have a lot of the same like tropes going on. The difference I would say is Coherence is much more character driven. It's all about who these individual people are. But I feel like in Triangle, really the only character that we are meant to care about or try to understand is the Melissa George character. Otherwise I felt like the rest were stock, which is kind of interesting because we have a Hemsworth in this one. Liam Hemsworth is in it. Granted, I think it was before maybe Hunger Games, or
that's a great question. I was thinking the same thing, that it was probably before Hunger Games, and that if you go to like the IMDb, or maybe it was Letterboxd, his name gets pushed up like towards like the second, and I don't think he is I mean, I would have said some other characters, like maybe Greg was more of like a leading role, but that's why I'm saying, like, I don't think Liam Hemsworth was as big as he was yet.
I honestly, I didn't feel like I knew any of the other characters at all. And maybe that's the point, because we do ultimately find out that she is the driver of the super loop.
Yeah.
It's on her more than anything else. That's something I want to talk about eventually, I guess, here. Even though we're in the 50-minute mark and we want to touch on something else.
Yes.
But let's start there. It's very clear, I think, in Coherence where the loop begins, but in Triangle I don't have a really good sense of where it begins.
No, and I think that's I mean, I think it was done well in that sense, that you could the last scene of this movie, you could start watching it and then it could just go right into
loop it from there.
Yes.
I thought that was cool. Structurally, it's very fun. The way that they film on the boat, on this huge barge, or what do you call that? It seemed like a cruise ship.
Yeah,
it's the size of a cruise ship.
A liner.
A liner. Okay. I loved the way that they moved on that boat. I thought it was really interesting how she was seeing herself doing things that she had just done 10 minutes ago in the film, and getting more of a context for why things were happening like that, and who was telling them all to kill each other, or specifically her to kill them all.
I really like how things unfold in this movie. But like, to what you were just saying, like when Melissa George first like looks down that hallway and she says, "This looks very familiar," as an audience member, I'm starting to think, okay, what's going on? You know, that's that moment where you're like, okay, she's been here before. Is this from her nightmare? Because she falls asleep on the sailing ship when she first gets there, and you don't know why she's so tired. But she's exhausted. She's exhausted physically and mentally for many reasons. Again, this cruise ship is huge. It's massive. And it's also, to what you were talking about earlier, the name of the ship is
Aeolus.
Yes, I think
the Greek god of wind.
Right. And
which makes a lot of sense. Actually, did you know who the... Yes, exactly. the director is Christopher Smith, who we talked about Severance. I think in our first cast was the film Severance, which we both really love.
Yeah.
And this is his follow up, and I haven't seen the two he's done subsequent to this, and it makes me want to watch them because I like this. No, is that good?
Black Death is great, and we could have talked about it when we were talking about like diseases and plagues. And it's a good watch, and it stars. Is it Sean Bean? Yeah, it's.
Oh, no kidding.
I think this guy, you expect more comedy out of him, and I think he got that out of his system with Severance. And I think his other movies are much more grounded, like this Triangle movie that is it's kind of exhausting to watch too when you think about it.
It is. I completely agree with you. I wouldn't. We're about to talk about another one, which is way more exhausting, I would argue, to watch than this one, in the repetitious nature of it. But yeah, this one is hard because she is so intense, Melissa George, and you understand that she's trying to get back to her son who has special needs, and she's willing to essentially kill everyone on board to get back to him. And it's just, it kind of grinds on you in a different way than some of the other ones did. Still really enjoyed it. And there are some really cool scenes, including the shipwreck. That's really well done, given the scale of this film, the way that the storm rolls in. I really dug that. I think I glad I saw it the first time. I don't know that I needed to see it the second time, other than to talk about it more acutely, sort of thing. In the way that I would go back and watch Coherence again and enjoy it again. I'm not sure I need to watch Triangle again.
I agree. I enjoyed this movie and I would recommend it to people, but I don't necessarily need to watch it again because I feel like when you watch this movie, because there's some repetition, I feel like I've already seen it like 5 times now.
I know. Yeah, I agree. But watch it the first time, and there's a lot going on worth watching.
Well made movie.
And let's finally talk about the one that I wanted to be.
I wanted to love this movie. I wanted to love this movie because I really like Brea Grant.
I don't think we were the audience that it was meant for.
No.
You know what I mean? Or if we were, things needed to be done in it to make it clear that we could learn from it, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because this one, more than any of the other ones, it's about misogyny, I would argue, and how women are kind of stuck in this loop of dealing with men that aren't listening to them, that are putting them down, that are kind of ruining their existences. They're putting them in constant dread just because, men.
Yes.
And
men are terrible.
In the way that movie Men actually did it in a manner in which I found entertaining and unique. This was really a slog for me, and I feel bad saying that because I understand that the writer who was the lead here, Brea Grant,
Brea Grant, I love her. Writer, so talented.
She's great. She literally has Reese Witherspoon's voice. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
It's insanely similar.
I think she understood the assignment. I think that she wrote this from a place of maybe something personal too. Maybe I don't know what she's been through, so I can't know how important this movie was to her, and I'm sure it was. And what you said is spot on. That was an important message. I feel like let's just talk about it as far as the repetition goes and comparing it to the other movies, because I think it could have been done a little bit more. Like, I'm not saying like montage more, but I
was exhausted by those that we already had because they all really felt the same to me. In the way that Triangle, they can change the pattern a little bit, and it made it interesting because she was seeing herself. This one doesn't have that same loop necessarily. It's more of a redundancy, a horror redundancy that keeps happening each night. That is really the underlying metaphor for, casual sexism that she deals with from her husband, one who essentially doesn't think anything of the fact that there's this intruder every night coming in there trying to kill her specifically.
Even though he is most likely what drove her to cheat on him.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I thought that was really interesting that she gave herself that that situation, or that
the backstory of
of it, because I think it's something that was also grounding her character. Like, no one's perfect. Like,
right.
she's just made mistakes as well.
Yeah.
But
I think it's probably she's acknowledging the fact that I think it's probably harder to get past a woman having cheated over a
that's a
man.
great point.
It's just
that's probably exactly it. You're right.
Not fair at all.
No.
But I think societally that is something that is kind of frowned down more upon the woman cheating than the man. And she's pointing out that this is not fair and this is a double standard and bullshit. But for me, like the killer, right, who was this amorphous male figure who actually he looked like he had saran wrap on his face, so it was really hard for me to take him seriously. And I know when she does take it off, it's all about this amorphous man. He's every man sort of thing.
Every man, yeah, that's it.
It wasn't scary for me, and I really feel like I wish we were talking to a girl about it and whether or not it was effective for her, and she saw her own plights within it. Because I don't know. I didn't. I don't know. It just wasn't enjoyable to watch for me, and I'm sorry that was the case.
I don't think it. I mean, it wasn't made for us. Although I think if you walk away from it with something, with a message, I mean, it clearly, I think, delivers that. Well, I mean, the world has been a lot easier for men, and
that is an important message. I just wish it was executed in a different way for me.
Yeah, because if you want to talk about it just from like the horror aspect, a lot of this movie is told during the daytime, if you recall, and I'm curious if it was to show that this isn't just this thing that's haunting her at night, that's something at the end of the day that she still has to deal with. And was it something that I also question, was this more like American Psycho? We're supposed to just like at the end of it think, is this only playing out in her head, Or did that little boy...
I mean, that would be more interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think so. In the way that it just cut after the amorphous man thing. And you're right. The fact that it did take place so much during the day, and then when she was attacked, it was only at night, with the exception of the end.
The end, yeah.
But the attacks weren't serious. The way he came at her wasn't serious. You know what I mean? It wasn't... The choreography of it was not effective for me. I was not in any moment like worried for her, because she's a very tough woman, and she wanted to keep going back to her home because she knew she could kick its ass. But at the same time, I just didn't like the fight scenes,
Yeah. I really wanted Bria Grant, who wrote and starred in it, I wanted her to direct it. And I'm sure she knows that director. It's a female director, which thank God. I mean, I'm glad Amanda didn't do this, and I don't know if that ever would have happened. Maybe this wouldn't have been made. But yeah, there are things just even about the way the guy just disappears immediately, and I think plays into the height.
Stop taking it seriously, then. That's you know what I mean.
Or like the interactions with the detective, and I understand what was going on there. He's asking
how patronizing he is, and essentially keeps bringing up, have you had problems with your husband? And she's all, it's not my husband. This is not my husband we're talking about. Even though the body type was exactly like her husband, the hair was exactly like her husband too.
Yes.
I mean, underneath, obviously we see the amorphous man face, but to everyone's naked eye, it did look like him. Granted, in the first attack, the husband's there and does subdue the guy.
Yeah.
So you kind of know it's not him, but at the same time, it looks like him, which I think was meant to be, because she is dealing with this kind of the casual misogyny, that he puts out there to her. Yeah.
So there's something also really interesting about specifically even like the sister-in-law character, who it would be delivering a line and then almost robotically then deliver another line. And I want to say that she wasn't the only character in the movie to do that. I think maybe and if it was just like people are programmed to say things.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the more interesting aspects, is that everyone kind of said, this is the way that it is.
Yeah.
And essentially we do have to follow this archetypal pattern of women aren't taking seriously, men are the ones controlling things. And she was not supported by her women. And that sister-in-law, like you said, did have those scars on her back that she hadn't seen before. And certainly was pointing to something horrific that had happened to her, but she wasn't willing to talk about it. She kind of like moved on, like you said, very robotically.
Yeah.
And then there's something at the heart of this movie that is really awesome. It
completely agree. And you could really tell in that moment when the editor comes by and says, I got you. He's basically taking credit, like I got you this great deal, and like, but he says you're lucky, and then like that's the title of the movie, and I think that's really where the message.
I worked my ass off for it.
Yeah, I worked my ass off. Stop saying I'm lucky. I did a lot of work.
It's a double standard.
Yeah, but
and that one's on Shudder if you guys are interested.
Yeah,
I reluctantly suggest watching it for the sake of the deeper meaning.
And another interesting spin on the slasher genre.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. Very true. But ultimately, we hope you listen to this very cast over and over and over and over again. We're going to boost those numbers here.
Yeah, well, it's Groundhog's Day again.
But till then, stay alive.
Stay alive.
Stay alive. Stay alive. Stay alive. Stay alive.